everyone. My name is Brenna Stroop, and I'm the Senior Associate of Public Policy at Independent Sector. We are very excited to welcome you to Jumpstart Your Advocacy by bringing data to life today. Today's event is presented in partnership with Quorum. Quorum is a software platform that enables organizations to launch their grassroots advocacy campaigns, manage stakeholder engagement, and monitor Washington, Brussels, all 50 states, and thousands of cities across the country. Before we get started today, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items really quick. You will notice on your screen that there is a Q&A box. Please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box throughout the presentation. And Kevin will go over any questions at the end of the presentation. And if you would like to start a conversation with any of your fellow event participants or send any comments, you are welcome to submit them to the chat box, which is right next to the Q&A. If you have any technical difficulties throughout, please email Sierra at sierraw@independentsector.org. And we will also share a copy of the recording and slides with you following the presentation. Now that we've gone over the logistics, we will jump in. We are very excited to welcome Kevin King as our speaker today. Kevin is the communications lead at Quorum, and I'll throw it over to Kevin now.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I appreciate it. As Brenna said, my name's Kevin. I'm the communications lead here at Quorum. We are a Washington, D.C. based startup that builds software tools for folks working in grassroots advocacy and public affairs at large. We work with a number of advocacy organizations across different industries and issues, and they use our tools to help mobilize their advocates to track the engagement of their grassroots campaigns and ultimately to impact the issues that they care about. In my work on the communications team, I've had the unique privilege and opportunity to speak with a number of our users and clients that we work with on the innovative ways that they're using data to inform their advocacy strategy. So I'm particularly excited for today's discussion, but before we get into the topics, I want to first take a step back and ask a straightforward question, which is, why data? Why should we be talking about this subject to begin with? And in many ways, data is so much more powerful than just a spreadsheet of information or a headache for your organization to have to deal with and address. In many ways, data can really revolutionize how your organization develops, executes, and measures the success of your grassroots advocacy campaigns. So I think that's important to keep in mind as we move to today's conversation. And I hope that you can extrapolate some best practices in each of those areas. So what are we going to talk about today? There are three different subjects that I want to speak to as it relates to data in your advocacy work. The first is going to be a conversation around how you can work to tell data-driven stories to elected officials. Then we're going to briefly go over different ways to be using data as a means for segmenting and targeting some of the campaign work that you're doing. And finally, we will round out our discussion by talking about how you can make more decisions informed by data, or in other words, data-driven decision-making. So to get things started, telling data-driven stories to legislators. There are really three steps for you to think about as you approach telling a data-driven story to an elected official. The first is to identify your most meaningful data sets. Next, create a compelling visual. And then finally, complement the data with real stories. So to start back up at the top of the page, identifying your most meaningful data set. The question on the screen here really helps illustrate this point, which is to ask yourself, what is the one data set that drives home the impact of your organization? If you've got the attention of an elected official and there's one set of data that you want to communicate, what would that be? I recently sat down with the folks over at Veterans for American Ideals, which are some Quorum grassroots clients. And what emerged from our conversation was the understanding that for Veterans for American Ideals, one of the most valuable data sets to them is knowing who among their supporter base is not just veterans, but actually related to a veteran or the spouse of a veteran. And then from there, how many grassroots actions have those individual groups taken on the specific campaigns that they've launched? Where this really comes in handy as a valuable data set is being able to go into Congresswoman X's office and say, I'm sure you're familiar that you represent a number of veterans in your district, but did you know that they've actually taken this many grassroots actions related to the campaigns that we've been launching here at VFAI. Here are the stories behind those campaigns. And boom, right away, you've already started to grab the attention of an elected official. And from there can start to continue to drive home a lot of the great advocacy work that you're doing. But a lot of it starts by using that first initial data set as the thesis for the work that you're doing. The next component to telling a data-driven story is thinking about how you can create some compelling visuals based off of that data set that you find particularly valuable. We absolutely live in a digital age where infographics drive a lot of conversation. Different charts and graphs make their way into policy conversations really often. And so thinking about how your organization can get creative with visualizing data can go a long way towards your advocacy efforts. And a great example of how this factors into storytelling actually came from some work that we here at Quorum did with the Entertainment Software Association. So ESA obviously represents a huge chunk of the entertainment software industry. And for them, one of the really valuable data sets is the location of different video game stores and video game studios across the country. And so what we did was we took that set of data, uploaded it into Quorum's system, and actually mapped it across each congressional district. What that provided for ESA were some really beautiful maps and visuals that their government affairs team was able to use when they went into meetings up on Capitol Hill to speak with legislators. A great example of what one of these maps looks like is actually on the screen there. You see a sample screenshot of Speaker Paul Ryan's district with some data points mapped across his district. And for ESA, this really brought a whole new dynamic to their conversations, because instead of just reciting a talking point to an elected official about, Congressman, you have 17 video game stores in your district, they were now able to bring in a map, whether it was on their iPad or on a printout, and actually, here are those 17 districts mapped, or 17 stores mapped across your district, and allowed them to layer in the story about the economic impact that their work is having. And that has really helped them take their advocacy conversations to the next level. The last component to data-driven storytelling that I want to focus on is a little unique to data itself and kind of sits outside the realm of data, and that is complementing the data that you're incorporating with real stories. I think this can sometimes be an overlooked strategy when organizations are looking to become more data-driven, that they leave behind what is most important and most valuable, which is the real human stories and the impact that certain policies are having on the issues that you work around. And so the text I have here up on the screen, I think it's a good reminder, which is that data isn't a constituent. Data does not vote. And so it's important that you still factor in those advocate stories. A few months ago, Quorum launched a brand new blog series as part of the communications work that I do here at Quorum called Behind the Desk, which is a series of exclusive interviews that we do up on Capitol Hill with different members of Congress about strategies and best practices for constituent engagement and grassroots advocacy and some of the unique things going on in their district. And a conversation we had a few weeks ago was actually with Representative Mark DeSaulnier of California, who has been one of the most vocal supporters of town halls in 2018. And we got in a conversation about fly-ins and advocacy groups coming in and meeting with him, and what are some of the key strategies for them to think about when they've scheduled a meeting with a member of Congress. And his two pieces of advice were, do your research and tell an authentic story. And I think that is perfect advice when we look at this slide as a whole for data-driven storytelling, which is when you do your research, you're identifying that data set that really matters, you're creating some compelling visuals to complement that data set, and then you're also factoring in real human advocate stories. The example that the congressman shared with us was about a group of community college students who were coming in to advocate to lower the price of textbooks. And they brought in a lot of great data about how expensive textbooks were in the district compared to other parts of the country. But from there, layered that data with stories about what that financial burden has done to them as working part-time students who have to take on another job or are still trying to support a family while going to school. And those were the kind of things that really stuck with the congressman. But it was all started by the data to really drive home why this issue is important to begin with. I'm going to leave this slide up on the screen here for a few seconds for folks to take any last notes you might have. And I do want to plug that you should feel free to ask any questions in the chat box about this section, and we can get to answering some of those towards the end of the presentation. Wonderful. Moving along to our next section, which is using data to segment and target some of the advocacy campaigns that you are organizing. So to start things off, segmenting. Well, what do I mean by segmenting? Why is it important to begin with? In this specific context, the way I'm talking about segmenting relates to how you can use data to segment campaigns by your supporters' preferences. You should treat your advocates like you would treat your friends. Get to know what they like and what they don't like. A great example here is if you know that your best friend doesn't have a Twitter, you wouldn't send them an advocacy campaign to tweet at their member of Congress. And that same level of understanding of different individuals' preferences should go into the work that your organization is doing with your advocates. We were very fortunate enough today to share a really strong example of how you can go about segmenting campaigns by data with the folks from Republican, which is an environmental advocacy organization, who actually shared with us a screenshot of a survey, which you can see up on the screen, that they sent to all of their supporters to get a sense of the different preferences for campaigns that they would want to participate in. This, of course, was all prompted because they were recognizing that not every supporter is willing to take the same level of actions on certain campaigns. So the survey you can see there on the screen allows advocates to check boxes of whether they want to share things on social media, whether they should sign a petition, or they'd be willing to write a letter to the editor, call a member of Congress, a number of different options. From there, the Republican team was able to collect all the data from the survey, parse out which supporters were willing to take which actions, and from there, moving forward, was able to deliver those specific campaigns to those specific advocates. And I think that's a really telling example of how data can play a key role in segmenting your campaigns. The next section here is around targeting, and specifically how you can leverage targeting in a way that is specific to legislative behavior and legislative actions taken by different elected officials. What I mean by that is instances of specific votes that are coming up that you could target a campaign around, or different committees that members of Congress sit on, or the actions that they're taking on social media and the dialogue that elected officials are putting out that allow you to that allow you to target your campaign. A great example of this came from a national nonprofit advocacy group that we were working with last summer during the major healthcare debate that was taking place in Congress. And what they did was launch a targeted campaign for their supporters first that were in congressional districts where a member of the House voted against the bill, and they offered a targeted campaign action, sending them a thank you letter, encouraging thanking them for their support in voting against the AHCA. And from there, they were then prompted with a letter to then send to their senator, encouraging them to also vote against the bill. So that was one group of targeted supporters. The next target campaign was sent to the supporters of their organization who were in districts in which the member of Congress voted for the bill. And they prompted that advocate to send a targeted campaign condemning the vote and letting them know the implications that would now have for their health insurance. And then in response to that, they prompted them to also send a letter to their senator as the bill moved across the chambers to be voted on. And I think this is a really nice, specific example of how your organization can use the actions of legislators to send targeted campaigns. In another world, they might have just sent out a blanket campaign encouraging every member of Congress to vote against the AHCA. But instead, they sent a targeted campaign based off the individual votes to build better relationships between the constituents and their elected official. If they had just sent a general campaign to members of Congress who had already been vocal about their support of one way or another on the healthcare legislation, it wouldn't have been as meaningful or as valuable. But tailoring that advocate action to the specific behavior of the legislator really helped build that credibility and made the most of the advocates' time when it came to the actions that they were taking. Again, I'm going to leave this screen up here for a few more seconds in case there are any last notes that you want to take on the segmenting and targeting of your campaigns. Great. Moving to our final topic of discussion today, which is making decisions informed by data. There are kind of three buckets that I think it's important to think about when it comes to your organization embracing data as a means for making good decisions. The first is A/B testing. Now, I particularly resonate with this topic as someone who not just has heard a lot of great strategies used by different clients and organizations that we work with at Quorum, but in my role as a marketer and communicator for this growing startup, I've had the unique opportunity to do a number of A/B tests as it relates to the different content or blogs or emails that we're sending out for Quorum. And so I think, across your industry, across your issues, A/B testing is a really valuable tool for experimentation and for thinking about the ways that you can define what really works for your organization. I think a great starting point for a lot of the folks here listening today would be A/B testing your email strategy. Obviously, email is a big part of the advocacy work that you're doing, and more than anything, the communication channel between you and your advocates. So whether you are testing the subject line of an email, maybe you're testing plain text versus some emojis in the subject line, or you're testing the length of the content of the email. You're going to do a few lines of text and then a call to action button, or you're going to play with it to do a longer amount of text to test, what attention span your advocates might have with certain content that you're serving them. You might even test the color of the call to action button. Maybe you find out that a blue button works better than a green button or a red button. And I think those are all different, strategies to consider with A/B testing. The one point I want to make here is certainly not to go overboard with your A/B testing. Your goal here is to really try to achieve statistical significance with the data. So controlling your tests to one specific thing. We're just going to test the subject line here, or just test the call to action button here. I think that's important to remember as your organization goes about leveraging A/B testing. The next strategy as it relates to making data-driven decisions is to practice good data sharing. This is a conversation that we've heard a number of times from different organizations that we work with. When they bring Quorum on as a tool and all of a sudden their grassroots team or their advocacy team is starting to get data-driven, they realize that other departments within their organization have sets of data that they didn't know existed that could be a really valuable part of the work they're doing. Good data sharing is important because you need all of the data you can get your hands on to make some of the most informed decisions about where you should be focusing your time and energy. So the question I have up on the screen, I encourage each of you to go back to your organization and to start that conversation, to ask, are there teams or departments who have sets of data that could be valuable for us? A great example of this was actually, we heard from a few nonprofits and trade associations who have coordinated with their membership team at their organization to get access to a little bit more qualitative data on the different members that are part of the organization, how long they've been members, maybe the amount of money they've donated over time, how they first came to join the organization. A lot of insights that could be valuable for crafting some creative campaigns that you hadn't maybe thought about. But that all comes from starting the conversation about data sharing in order to make some of the best decisions for your advocacy work. The final bullet here on the screen relates to building incentive structures as a way to kind of optimize the engagement that you're seeing on your campaigns. The first step to this strategy is to really collect all of the engagement data that you've had on grassroots campaigns that you've launched. Take a 30,000 foot view at it and figure out, okay, where are the holes and where are the gaps in this data? Where there are certain campaign types that work better than others. We noticed a Twitter campaign was far more successful than our Write a Letter campaign. Okay, you've identified that. And then you see with your Write a Letter campaign that it was actually some of our younger supporters that were taking more actions versus our older supporters. And now you're starting to really dig deeper into the layers of the data. And from there, devise strategies for incentivizing for those weak spots. A great example of this was actually, we heard from a association partner that we work with that had noticed that there were individual state chapters that weren't quite seeing the same levels of engagement for grassroots actions in that region. So what they decided to do was, after identifying that data, craft a campaign that incentivized whichever state chapter could garner the most grassroots actions in their area would receive a discounted membership as a way to really start to fuel more activity within that chapter. And I think that's a great, great strategy to think about. Another one that we've heard about actually related to an organization creating super advocates. So really encouraging folks to take multiple actions instead of just one. And from there, they could earn a level of points to receive different swag or free materials, or just general promotion within the organization and visibility about, these are our top advocates, our super advocates. And that was really a strategy that helped them incentivize a lot more engagement across the board. So that's a valuable strategy to consider when it comes to making a data-driven decision. To quickly recap what we've gone over so far, and I hope we do have some time here to answer some questions. I wanted to make sure to get through everything in the best way possible. First, we started out by talking about how you can tell data-driven stories to legislators. So identifying that meaningful set of data that can become the thesis for your story, crafting some really compelling visuals to complement that story, and then incorporating real human advocate stories as a part of that data. And we can remember the advice that we got from Congressman Rep. Mark DeSaulnier, who said, you should do your research and tell an authentic story when you have the opportunity to talk to a member of Congress. From there, we went over just some brief strategies around how you can segment and target your campaigns with data. On segmenting, we talked about how you can segment by your advocate's preference, and we looked at a survey that was sent out to kind of figure out what actions folks were willing to take. And then from the targeting perspective, we looked at specific actions that we wanted to target around based off of a legislator's behavior. And remember the healthcare debate and how an organization was able to target based off specific votes happening in the House. And then finally, we just wrapped up a conversation on making decisions informed by data. So A/B testing, practicing data sharing, and then building incentive structures based off of the engagement data that you've looked at to try to really maximize for the most activity as possible. That is all of the thoughts that I have to share with each of you today. I do hope some of this has been helpful. I would really encourage you to reach out if you have any strategies that your organization has been using as it relates to data. Please feel free to send me a note at kevin@quorum.us. And then I also, of course, have to plug, if you're interested in learning more about Quorum, we've got some really fantastic tools that we'd love to show you as it relates to grassroots advocacy, as well as some of the federal and state level legislative tracking that your organization might be interested in doing. With that said, I will turn it over to Brenna to field some questions to see what you guys have been thinking about.
So thank you, Kevin, for giving us tons of very useful information. And I just want to remind everyone that we will be sending out the slides and a recording of the webinar within the next day or so. So if you want to go back and look at some of the tips, you are more than welcome to do that. And then I'll go through some of the questions that we've gotten so far. So the first question, Kevin, that we have is this only useful in the legislation setting, or can it also be used to present to stakeholders, donors, etc.?
Oh, that's a really, really strong question. And I would say absolutely not. It is not limited to the legislative setting. We've seen a number of organizations who are interested in leveraging data to really communicate the value of the work they're doing to stakeholders across the board. So if you've got a number of emails that you send out to different stakeholders of your organization, it can be valuable to incorporate in those emails, hey, here's an update on some of the grassroots work that we've been doing, a few charts about different levels of engagement that we've seen with campaigns. And I think that it speaks to informing your stakeholders about some of the work you're doing. There's certainly other data that you can be collecting on your stakeholders as it relates to different ways that they're interacting with your organization. So certainly not limited to that. And I'd encourage your organization to think about similarly, what is specific data that helps tell the story of some of the stakeholders within your organization.
All right, the second question we have is, this seems a bit intimidating. If you could give one piece of advice to an organization that has yet to dip their toes into using data at all, what would it be, and where should they start?
That's a great point, and I totally understand, and we certainly empathize with that. Data can absolutely be overwhelming, to the point I made earlier. I would encourage you to first just start simple. I really can't emphasize enough the first point I made on the telling data-driven stories section. Start with the one data set that's most valuable, and really kind of put in the effort, and it will be a lot of work, but once you've got a sense of the data that is most valuable, everything will fall in place from there. And you'll start to realize that, oh, we have been acting in this way, or we have been executing campaigns in this way, without even knowing that it's in the best interest of the data that we have. So just because you're digging into data doesn't mean you've got to revamp all of your processes. In fact, data can often be really validating to the things you're already doing. And I think that can also be a breath of fresh air, something else to think about to hopefully temper any overwhelming feelings that you might have.
All right, the next question is, what is A/B? Am I the only one?
That's a great question. So A/B testing is just it's a strategy that's embraced across the marketing industry with the goal of presenting information in two different ways to test them against each other. So A/B refers to option A and option B. If I was going to A/B test an email that I was sending, I want to specifically test the A/B of the subject line. So option A might be exclusive interview with member of Congress. That's the subject line. Option B might be, the emoji camera, a camera emoji with behind the scenes with Rep de Saulnier. And right away, I'm testing the text of an email in option A, or the text of a subject line in option A with an emoji in option B. And from there, once you send out an email and you evaluate, okay, what is the metric that I'm trying to see? Well, I'm trying to see which email gets the most clicks based off the subject line. I see that the emoji elicits 20% more clicks than the plain text subject line. Great, option B was the best option here. And that's kind of the best way to break down a simple A/B test. So hopefully that hypothetical was valuable.
So you did such a good job answering that. You also answered one of the other questions.
Wonderful, two birds with one stone.
So the next one is, how can I get leadership on board with using data?
Yeah, we hear that a lot. A few things. I think the first thing would be, there's a number of success stories that you can reference as a great selling point to leadership. So we often hear from folks who ask that similar question of, hey, I really need to convince my board that this is valuable, that this is worth the investment. What can you share with me? And the best thing that I actually could offer would be some case studies that are on Quorum's website. So another plug for Quorum, but I do think it's relevant. If you go to our website, we've got a number of case studies about ways that organizations are using a tool like Quorum that's very data-driven to sell impact and ROI about the work that they're doing. The other thing I would say is kind of a recall to an answer I gave earlier, which is to start simple and to really execute on data-driven campaigns and then deliver that information to your leadership. So I would practice some of the strategies that we've talked about. If you see success, take that to your leadership, take that to your board and say, hey, we implemented some new strategies around, embracing data. We saw this success. Are you happy with that? And usually that can really help communicate to leadership the value that data can play in your work.
Well, we're going to close out the webinar now, but we just want to thank everyone for participating today. And as we said, we will definitely send out the slides and a copy of the recording for you all as well. And we want to give a big thank you to Kevin for helping us today, doing a great job on the presentation. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and have a great day.
Thank you very much.